What if I told you Myfitnesspal is the most powerful tool on the planet for building lean muscle and losing body fat? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how some of the world's best personal trainers use Myfitnesspal to get incredible results with their clients. Hi guys, Jay Baker, founder of CEO My Health, helping busy men reclaim and optimize their health. And in this video, we're going to be running into more advanced features of Myfitnesspal and how you can really use that to dominate your health. Now, if you haven't already seen our beginner's tutorial on how to use Myfitnesspal, click on this video over here, or I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, before we go into how to use the app to help build lean muscle and lose body fat, let's go and have a look at exactly what that means and what that looks like with regards to our diet. Now, if you're only interested in building lean muscle, simply go into the description and click on the timestamp to fast forward to that section. First, let's start with fat loss. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that fat loss is dictated by a couple of core principles we need to be following. First, we need to be in a calorie deficit, and this simply means that we're burning more energy than we are consuming through our diet. Secondly, it's important that we consume enough protein in our diet, because that's really going to help to preserve and look after our muscle mass. And lastly, we really need to make it sustainable for the long term. And that requires making sure we're including foods that we really enjoy. And then also, if we are in a deficit, that it's not too extreme, that we can maintain that deficit over the long term. So with those principles at front of mind, let's now jump into the app and see how we can use Myfitnesspal to achieve our fat loss goals.
Alright, so let's jump into how to use Myfitnesspal to lose body fat. And I'm going to try and make this as simple as I can. I don't want to try and make it more confusing than it needs to be, because in essence, fat loss is actually fairly simple in theory. It's just executing on the theory is where we make it really difficult on ourselves. So I want to try and keep it really simple. If you haven't seen the beginner video yet on how to use Myfitnesspal, definitely jump back and watch that before you continue on here, because otherwise a few things won't really make too much sense to you. So make sure you've got a good understanding of how to use the app to start. So what we need to do first of all is we're going to be setting our goal, so our fat loss goal. So what we're going to do is click on more down the bottom here. And if you saw the beginner video, we went through this. So clicking on goals, and then from there we have our weekly goal. So select that, and mine's already at 0.5 kilo. So I want you to select that, because that's what our goal is going to be to start. Now, a lot of people say, why 0.5 kilo, which equates to about 1 pound a week. Why 0.5 kilo? Why 1 pound? It just doesn't seem like much in the grand scheme of things, because, you know, I'm watching people on TV and they lose 4 or 5 kilo a week. I want to be like that. Well, remember, when we go back to our core tenets with fat loss, right? It needs to be something that's sustainable for the long term, because I'm guessing that you've tried to lose body fat before, and what's happened is you've lost a fair amount of weight and then you've put it back on. Right? And I'm telling you now, the reason that that has happened, based on 14 years of working with people just like you, is because you try to bite off more than you can chew, and it's not sustainable for the long term. So we need to find a way of eating that is going to be sustainable for the long term and is going to give you consistent results. Because half a kilo a week doesn't sound like much, but that's 26 kilo a year, or over 52 pound a year. That's a lot of weight, no matter how much you weigh. Let's get that through your head first. Let's rewire what we see as success when it comes to weight loss, because that's very, very important. So half a kilo a week is going to be our goal. Now, for us to achieve half a kilo a week, we need to stack the odds in our favor, because we need to stay in that deficit for the long term, particularly if we've got a fair amount of weight to lose. Even 10 kilo, you know, you're looking at 20 weeks of hard work to achieve that result. Now, the way we're going to stack these odds in our favor is by making sure we're getting adequate protein intake in our diet. Now, why is that important? Well, protein is very, very important, not only because it's going to help look after and retain muscle mass as you stay in a calorie deficit, but what it's going to do is it's going to fill you up. It's very, very satiating. So it's going to help keep you full, which is super important if you're in a calorie deficit, right? Because when you're in a deficit, you're going to be a little bit hungry. So if we're eating foods that are going to be beneficial for filling us up, that's a win-win, okay? Because if you've got a diet right now that's highly processed, refined foods, refined carbohydrates, trans fats, I can tell you now, you're consuming a ton of calories and they are not filling you up. And that's a recipe for disaster. You will not win. You will not stay in a deficit eating processed foods. It's just too hard. You're just fighting against all these urges to continue to eat. Food companies have made this food so palatable that it is very, very hard not to overconsume on it. Okay, so that's why protein's really, really important. It's going to fill us up, it's satiating, but also it's metabolically taxing. What does metabolically taxing mean? It means that when we consume it, our body burns a lot of energy just in the digestion process. So when we consume, say, 100 calories of chicken breast, our body actually burns somewhere around 20 to 30% of those calories just in the digestion and assimilation of that protein. So if we eat 100 calories of chicken breast, we're going to burn off 20 to 30 calories just in digesting it and getting it to where it needs to be. Now that doesn't sound like a lot in the short term, but trust me, in the long term, that is huge, and it's going to be massive with regards to getting you the result that you're looking for. Now there's a food guide that has all of this for you with regards to what foods are high in protein, what foods are best suited to helping you achieve your body fat goals. So the good guys at Precision Nutrition, Barati and the team over there, they have put together this amazing food guide, and I've got a link in the description so you can go there, you can download this. Like, this thing has everything that you need. It has all the foods separated in the right categories: protein, carbohydrates, fats. We're going to be talking about that very, very soon as to what those different macronutrients mean for you and how that's going to help get you the result that you need. Okay, so with that being said, let's move on to macronutrients, which is what I just mentioned: proteins, carbohydrate, fat. What is that? Well, down the bottom on our screen now, you can see nutrition goals, and below that we have calorie, carbs, protein, and fat goals. So I want you to select that now. Now on the screen here, you're seeing a couple of categories. The first one is our calorie goal for the day. So remember, we want to be in a deficit, and that's put us at a deficit of 1,850 calories a day. So that's roughly where we want to be with our food consumption. Now below that, we have what we call macronutrients. And these, think of these as nutrients that we need in large quantities, right? We've got macro and micro. So micro is all your little trace minerals and vitamins. Think of things like magnesium, vitamin B, those types of things. Macronutrients are carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And that's typically what our foods are made up of. Okay, and in the guide we talk about these as well, and the foods are categorized for you so it won't be too confusing in trying to differentiate what is what. Now, as we mentioned, protein is super important. Now, at the moment, Myfitnesspal's sort of given us a guide as to the percentages of our daily calories they want us to eat. But we're going to change these because these are nowhere near optimal when it comes to achieving your fat loss goal. So we talked about protein wanting to be very, very high because that's going to give us our best shot at achieving fat loss and staying in a deficit. Now, at the moment, I'll give you an example. If you've got the standard American diet, this is typically what your macros will look like at the moment. So your carbs are probably going to be up somewhere near 60%. Your protein will be somewhere near 10%. And your fat will be 30%. Okay? Now, that's because you've probably got a diet that's very refined and highly processed, and most highly processed refined foods tend to be high in carbohydrate, and then they've got a bit of fat in there to make them all nice and tasty for you. We need to start switching this around. So if you feel like your protein intake is super low at the moment, we're going to bump it up to somewhere around 25% or even 30%. And we can go as high as 40% on this, but I want you to work your way up to there. So select 25 or 30% based on how much protein you think you're consuming in your diet at the moment. And that's typically foods like meats, seafood, egg, protein powder is another common one. So foods like that, which you'll find in the food guide. From there, carbohydrates and fat, how we differentiate the two when it comes to percentages is going to be up to you and what is best suited to you. For an example, I tend to do very well on a higher fat, lower carb style diet, particularly when I'm leaning out, because carbs tend to make me a little bit hungry, and if I'm trying to stay in a deficit, that makes things a little bit hard. Now, that might not be what's best for you, particularly if you're coming off a diet that has been highly refined and processed, because you've probably been eating a lot of carbohydrates. And the last thing you want to do is try cut your carbs out, because you're not going to be able to sustain that. So let's say we keep your protein at 30%, and let's say you have come off a highly processed diet. Maybe we keep your carbohydrates up at 50% and drop your fat back to 20%. Now, this may not mean much to you right now, it may be a little bit confusing, but as you look at the food guide and as you start to incorporate these foods into the Myfitnesspal diary, it's going to show you what your breakdown of macronutrients are based on what your current diet is. So that's going to be really important. Now, if you're not coming off a highly processed diet, maybe you'll start at somewhere around 30% for carbohydrates, or 40%, and then the rest will be made up with fat. But that's something that I want you to play with. All right, so let's set those for where they currently are right now. Okay, so that's all done, and then what it's done here, beside them, it has a rough breakdown of how many grams of each macronutrient I'll need to hit that goal. So 139 grams of carbohydrate, 139 gram of protein, and 82 grams of fat. Now, if you're consuming foods that have labels on them, if you flip the food over and have a look at the label, your macronutrients will be broken down on there as well. So that when you're shopping for foods, you can get a good idea just by having a look at the label, what its makeup is with regards to macronutrients. So that's something that's important to start to get more educated in. When you're shopping, you have a good understanding of the macronutrient makeup of those types of foods. And if you go and look at all your highly processed foods that you're probably eating right now in your pantry, you'll notice that they're very high in carbohydrate and probably very high in fat as well, and probably quite low in protein, which is the opposite of what we're looking to do right now. Now, if we come back to our main page here and we click our calories remaining up the top, so our little calorie tracker, that's going to come up with a couple of options here in our nutrition tab. Now, this nutrition tab can also be found at the very bottom of our diary. If we hit nutrition, it's the same thing. So over on the left in calories, this is giving us a breakdown of where our calories are coming from. So as you can see here, I've logged breakfast and lunch just as an example. So it's got 44% of the calories so far eaten today have come from my breakfast, and 56 have come from lunch. That's not overly important to us. The next category is, so let's click on nutrients. This is a page that you're going to be getting accustomed to, because effectively what it is, it's giving us a breakdown of our macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fats just down below fiber and sugar. These are the ones that we want to keep track of, but more importantly, it's given us our goal as to how much we need to be consuming in the day and how many grams of each of those macronutrients we have left for the day. Okay, so this is something that you want to be checking in throughout the day, because you want to get a rough idea of if you're on track to hitting these targets. And as you get more experienced in knowing your numbers a little bit better and understanding foods and what their macronutrient makeup is, you're going to be able to start to eyeball and figure out, let's say we get to dinner and we need to consume around about 500 calories, and we know that in that 500 calories we need to be getting about 50 grams of protein, and then the rest is going to be made up with fat and carbohydrate. We can start to figure out, okay, what would that meal look like for me to hit those numbers? And you need to be obsessive at the start. You need to start to get a better education and understanding with your food. You can't just stay ignorant when it comes to your diet and not understand what you're doing but expect a result. That's not how it works. You need to become an expert in understanding this. For the sake of taking 5 to 10 minutes every day to log your food and have a quick look and understand it, for the reward of being in good health and having the body that you want and maintaining the body fat levels that you want, I don't know, I just think 10 minutes is nothing in the grand scheme of things. Now remember with this, sustainability is the biggest thing that we are looking for here. Now, you're going to have shit days. You are going to have bad days. Not every day is going to be perfect. You're not going to stick with all the foods that are on the food guide that are all whole foods. It's just not going to work like that. You're going to have slip-ups. You're going to have times where you start to emotionally eat because you're stressed at work or you're stressed with the family. And maybe that's something that plays a big part in your life, that you're constantly emotionally eating. If that is something that you struggle with, I definitely recommend going out and seeking help, because that's not something that is going to fix itself. You need somebody to help you with that. I hope macronutrients make sense to you. It's really, really important that you learn and understand it. And the biggest thing there is that protein intake. It's really important that you're hitting those numbers, because that's going to give you the best shot at staying in that calorie deficit. Now, one last thing before we exit out of here is a big mistake that people make is as their body weight comes down, so they're losing body fat, they don't adjust their calorie intake and they automatically think they hit this plateau. Let's say you've got a goal of losing 15 kilo or 30 pounds or whatever it equates to. And let's say you're halfway. So let's say you've lost about 7 kilo, and then all of a sudden you hit this plateau and you go, well, why has my weight stopped? I'm eating the same foods that got me the 7 kilo. Why won't it get me another 7? Now, there's a number of different factors that are at play here, but one of the most simplistic things that you can do is change what your current weight is, because that will adjust your calorie intake for the day. As an example here, so my calorie goal is 1850, right? Now, if I come into my goals here and let's say my goal weight is 70 kilo, and let's say I've lost 5 kilo, right? So now my new weight is 75 kilo, and then we go back to that main screen. Now it's readjusted what my daily calorie intake is. Now it hasn't readjusted it by much, but it has adjusted it. So it's taken it down to 1780, because as your weight comes down, just think about it. The amount of energy that you burn throughout the day is less because you're carrying less weight around. I hope that makes sense, but it's really important to understand because people think what gets them from A to B is going to get them from B to C, and it doesn't work like that. More often than not, you have to adjust your food intake, which is going to be less because you're going to be burning less energy. You're going to be working against your body as well because it doesn't like being in a deficit. So what it's going to do is try and slow you down. And it does that by making you feel a bit sluggish, a bit lethargic, which means you're not going to be twiddling your thumbs as much. You're not going to be walking around as much. And it's going to try find a way to make up that deficit so you're not burning as much energy. So that's important to keep in mind. Keep adjusting what your current weight is, because that will keep adjusting what your goal calories are for the day. But be mindful of what the body is doing as you're in a deficit and as you're losing weight. It's not somebody that's going to try and help you get the weight off. You know, you're going to be a little bit hungrier at times than what you currently were. So keep that in mind, that it's going to get a little bit harder as that body fat comes down. And if you do hit that plateau, make sure every week you're taking a step back so you can have a look at where your body fat is, how your results are going, and if you need to change anything with regards to your level of activity or the types of foods that you're eating, just making sure you're staying on top of things. So I hope that's made a little bit more sense with regards to using the app for fat loss. Just to reiterate those 3 key principles when it does come to fat loss is you've got to make sure what you're doing is sustainable, and going for something like half a kilo or a pound a week is really going to be the sweet spot for you. Trust me, I've been doing this for over a decade and a half now, and that is a great goal to be aiming for. Don't try and overdo it, because I'm telling you now, it'll be another yo-yo diet that you start and finish and stack the weight all back on. Next, make sure protein intake is really, really important, okay? Because it's going to help fill you up, it's going to look after your muscle mass, but most importantly, it's leading into that third principle, which is staying in that calorie deficit over the long term, because that is where the fat loss results come from.
Now, if you're not sure on what types of foods you should be eating that are going to give you your best shot at fat loss, I'll leave a link in the description below to our food guide that's going to be really handy as you go into achieving these fat loss goals. Okay, now let's jump in to building lean muscle. Now, if you are looking to build lean muscle, but you still have a good amount of body fat to lose, what I would recommend is really attack the body fat first and get that down to a comfortable level, and then move on to building lean muscle. And the reason we do this is your body is much more efficient at building lean muscle when it has a lower percentage of body fat. So rather than trying to do 2 things at once, just focus on one goal at a time. Let's jump into the key principles around building muscle. First off, unlike fat loss, we need to be in a slight calorie surplus. And this simply means we consume a little bit more food in our diet above what we would call our maintenance level. We also need to make sure we're getting adequate amounts of protein in our diet, because that really is the building blocks of muscle. Lastly, we need a lot of consistency and time around following the diet. And you're also going to need to be putting a fair amount of work in at the gym, because that's really where you're going to be building the muscle mass. So let's jump back into Myfitnesspal and see how we're going to use the app to build that lean muscle.
Okay, so let's get into how we can use Myfitnesspal to build muscle. Now, before we get into that, if you haven't seen the beginner video on how to use Myfitnesspal, which we made recently, definitely go back and check that out because that's going to give you a lot more information on how to use Myfitnesspal if you're not familiar with it. So that's really, really important. Also, if you've skipped forward in this video to find out how to build muscle and you've skipped over the how to lose body fat part, I'd still strongly recommend, even if it's not a goal, go back and listen to that part because there'll be a few things in here with regards to how to use Myfitnesspal that can still be helpful in building lean muscle. So how is it exactly that we build muscle in the first place? Because we can't just have a good diet and expect our muscles to grow. That's not what happens. So the first thing that it's important to wrap your head around is to build muscle mass, we need to be breaking and tearing the muscle fibers. And typically we do that through things like weight training or resistance training. And what happens when we're building muscle is by lifting weights, we tear the muscle down, and our body doesn't particularly like that. So what it does is it repairs the muscle to be bigger and stronger. And that's where our results, that's where we build muscle mass from. The second part to it is the diet, because that's important as well. There's a couple of key things we need to be doing with our diet to optimize our results that we're getting from weight training. In particular, we need to make sure we've got enough protein in, which we'll talk about shortly. And we want to be in a calorie surplus because we want to be growing. So the first thing we're going to do with the app is we need to go in and set our goal. So we're going to click on more down the bottom. We're going to come over to goals. And then from here, I've already put some in, but let's click on weekly goal. And we've got a couple of options here. We can either gain 0.2 kilo a week or 0.5 kilo a week. So around about a half a pound to a pound a week. Now, I definitely recommend starting off at 0.2 kilo a week. And the reason being is you probably underestimate how much food you're consuming at the moment. And the last thing you want to do is start stacking on large amounts of body fat as you build muscle. You want to be stacking on as much lean muscle mass as you can, and you don't need to be in a huge calorie surplus to do that. So let's select 0.2 kilo a week, and that's going to be our goal. And then up here, above that, we've got current weight and goal weight. So typically speaking, building lean muscle takes time. Like it really does take time. If you're expecting to see anything dramatic in your first 6 months physically, it's not going to happen. It really does take time. So what I'd recommend is working hard for 12 months, so a full year, and then you can expect to see some results physically. You know, you'll start to see different body parts growing, you'll start to see things firming up, particularly if you've got body fat to lose at the same time. You'll find you'll start seeing some physical results. But to get really significant results with building lean muscle, you're looking at a number of years. So it's important to keep that in mind because people get very impatient and give up when they don't feel like they're getting results. You will see strength gains fairly quickly. You'll see your strength numbers start to go up when you're lifting weights. But for the most part, the physical changes really do take time. So keep that in mind. Now, putting in your current weight here and your current goal, why I talked about that is, again, you don't want to be biting off more than you can chew here. So for my goal weight here, I've got, let's increase my overall weight. So ideally, bringing on 5 kilo of muscle mass. And that's going to take a fairly long time, most likely more than 12 months. Okay, so that's a really good goal. What we need to do next is change our macronutrients because as I mentioned, with building lean muscle, we need to make sure we're getting plenty of protein in our diet. So if we select nutrition goals, calorie, carbs, protein, and fat goals, now we can change these numbers around. So Myfitnesspal's got us at a default mode at the moment where carbohydrates are at 50%, protein's at 20%, and fat's at 30%. Ideally, in a perfect world, to build lean muscle, we want our protein up above 30%. Ideally, more towards 40%. Okay, so let's just change that to somewhere in the middle at the moment. Let's go 35%. And the reason I gave two options there is because you probably don't have a lot of protein in your diet at the moment. So jumping from 10%, which is probably where you're at the moment, or less, up to 40% is probably not realistic for you. When you see how much that is with regards to high protein foods, it's actually quite a lot. So somewhere around 30% will be a good place to start if you don't have a lot of protein in your diet already. Otherwise, 35% is a pretty good number too. Now, carbohydrates, I personally like to keep that a little bit higher on the scale. There is a lot of evidence around higher carbohydrate intake being beneficial for promoting building of muscle. So what we're going to do is stick to around about 40% for our carbohydrates, and in this instance, that's going to leave us 25% with fat. Now, what you can see once that change has been made, next to each of our macronutrients, we've got how many grams per day we need to be consuming of those macronutrients. So carbohydrates would be 261, protein would be 228, and fat would be 73 grams. And then our overall calorie goal for the day is about 2,600 calories. So that's our target that we need to be aiming for, which will put us at that 0.2 of a kilo surplus per week. If you're not 100% sure on the types of foods that you need to be eating to build lean muscle, what I've done is down in the description, I'll leave a link to a guide put together by a company called Precision Nutrition, who are really good when it comes to their food information and dieting information. And that will really help categorize the different foods into their different categories when it comes to macronutrients. So that's really, really key, because if you want your protein to be high, you can't guess. You need to be knowing what types of foods that you need to be eating. So that's a really handy guide. Definitely get over after you've watched this video and find that link and download that, and even print it out and keep it somewhere handy so you can get really familiar with the types of foods that you need to be eating to build lean muscle. Now, if you didn't watch the earlier part of the video where we went through how to lose body fat, I'll just show you something here so you don't miss it. If we come down to nutrition at the bottom of the diary page, we can select nutrition, or our other way of getting into this is on the home page, just hitting our calorie remaining calculator up the top, and then we can scroll down into nutrition that way. Now, here is a really good graph that we can check how much of our macronutrients we have remaining in the day. So for example, I've just put in a few different foods and it's shown me that my protein goal is 228 grams for the day, and so far I've had 62 grams. Carbohydrates is 261 is the goal, I've had 40. And then down at fat, 73 grams is the goal, I've had 39 already. And then on the far right, it tells you how much you've got left for the day. Now that's really important that you keep checking in on those numbers, because particularly if you get towards the end of the day and you haven't really pre-planned out your meals, it's good to understand what sort of foods you need to be including in your last meal or two to be able to hit those particular numbers. Most important one being protein. So if you've had a slow start to the day with protein intake and you still need a solid 80-90 grams with your last meal, you need to get a bit smarter about how to plan out your days right, so you're not leaving yourself such a large amount to try and reach with one meal remaining in the day or a few hours left in your day. So that comes with practice. Again, as I mentioned in the fat loss section, you need to be a little bit obsessive about this at the start so you get that knowledge and education. And when you have the knowledge and education, you really don't need to be using apps like Myfitnesspal, because you'll start to figure it out fairly easily. You'll be able to eyeball different types of meals and sort of know roughly how much of each macronutrient's in it and roughly what you need in your day. So it becomes much simpler. But in that learning phase early on, it's really, really important to make sure that you're getting as close to these macro goals as you can, because on top of your weight training, that's really going to help assist you in building as much lean muscle as you possibly can. So also important to remember is, as your weight changes, you need to be changing your weight in the app, because that's going to change your calorie intake for the day. So if we come into goals again, current weight's at 75. So as an example, let's say I'm changing this to 78. And then if I come back to the main page, depending on what your goal is, it may change the calorie intake for the day. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Same thing with your goal. If your goal all of a sudden changes from you want to be 80 kilo and it's moved to 83 kilo, make sure you're putting that in, because that's going to change that calorie intake goal for the day, which will in turn change your macro intake for the day.
Just like losing body fat, building lean muscle takes time, so remain consistent and continue to track your progress. Now, if you need a guide on the best suited foods for building lean muscle, and also foods that are high in protein, which is really important, I'll leave a link in the description below. So I hope you found plenty of value in this video. Go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe and turn the bell on, as we bring out new videos every single week. And if you've got any questions personally around how you can use the app to dominate your health, go ahead and leave a comment in the comment box below, and I'll be sure to get back to you as soon as I can. And I'll see you in the next video.